McLaren has put a huge amount of pressure on itself for the rest of the F1 season, and now it really cannot afford to make any mistakes with either Lando Norris or Oscar Piastri in the title run-in. The dominance McLaren has enjoyed in the two championships this year has had a cost. It's created a tense, close fight between points leader Piastri and Norris. It's the ultimate manifestation of the cliched good problem to have, with McLaren trying to ensure both its drivers get a fair crack at the title. But is it trying too hard? And is that creating a bigger problem than anything else in this battle? The fight has been so good-natured that Piastri and Norris have barely registered a complaint between them, even when Norris clumsily drove into Piastri in Canada and Piastri launched a couple of near-miss moves in Austria and Hungary. That's as bad as it got. It's what McLaren has done that has brought criticism from fans and increasingly intense scrutiny, never more so than in the Italian Grand Prix. Intervening at Monza and ordering Piastri to give a place back to Norris gained by McLaren's error in the pit stop was an escalation in the team trying to practice what it preaches in terms of fairness. It's shown how far McLaren is willing to go to back up its principles with action, and that exposes a problem. Unless McLaren is absolutely perfect for the rest of the season, which is highly unlikely, it will need to intervene again in order to be consistent. Otherwise, one way or another, it will tip the scales in this fight, and it will need to make arbitrary judgments at every race on where the line is in terms of interfering with the outcome. In isolation, that was very easy to do in Italy, a blatant team mistake made by a shared party, rather than what could be defined as Piastri's side of the garage, in a race Piastri was unlikely to beat Norris in, and in a situation easily rectified with the cars running together on track and under no immediate threat from behind. But it might not be so simple again, and it relies on the two drivers playing ball, which may be harder to do if there is more on the line than the 6-point swing that Piastri could ultimately afford to swallow on this occasion. We're not trying to get too bogged down in what happened at Monza though, it's what it means for other situations that makes it clear how complicated the situation McLaren has created, even if it's for the right reasons. Inevitably, there are some very agitated voices from people on Piastri's side, or who are anti-Norris or critical of Zak Brown's management. The Monza switch is seen as evidence that McLaren is doing everything it can to help Norris or bail him out, a suggestion that's cropped up from some fans before, such as in the Hungary strategy switch. It's also triggered talk of all manner of hypothetical situations that this precedent could supposedly influence, even as ridiculous as what happens if one driver crashes. Let's brush past the talk of precedent here though, as we covered that in our post-race Monza video, which you can watch here. As we say, the controversies in the drivers' title battle will be repeated unless the team is absolutely perfect and totally equal across both cars for the remainder of the season. Given how hard it is to do that on a single weekend, it won't happen. And as Mercedes boss Toto Wolff warned in the aftermath of Monza, what do you judge as fair? Sure, it's not fair for a driver to lose out because of a pit stop mistake that affected their rival, but you could argue it's also not fair to ask a driver down on points to forfeit a chance to catch up. McLaren famously wandered into this territory in a different era with Mika Häkkinen's first two Grand Prix wins in 1997 and 98, when it ordered David Coulthard to let Häkkinen pass because it felt Häkkinen had been unfairly delayed, in the second case because Mika misheard a radio message and pitted unnecessarily from the Melbourne lead. Imagine that happening in the age of polarised fan bases on social media. Back then, any unease fizzled out because Häkkinen went on to dominate Coulthard for the next 2 seasons, but this year's problem is not going to go away. The Monza intervention came a week after McLaren inadvertently influenced its drivers' championship battle in a much bigger way as Norris retired from the Dutch Grand Prix with a mechanical problem, specifically a broken engine oil line, which McLaren said was a problem on its side and not engine supplier Mercedes' responsibility. This lost Norris 18 points, a much bigger swing than the 6-point one that occurred at Monza, which let Norris trim Piastri's margin from 34 to 31 points instead of seeing it rise to 37. What if the roles were reversed? Piastri was poised to beat Norris again, and Norris found himself fortuitously ahead. Might there not be a sense of karmic retribution for Norris that having been screwed out of 18 points at one race, he was getting some back? What about a different kind of team operational error on the car side? It's nonsense to suggest that if one car retires or crashes out, the other car must be parked to ensure total parity, but what about a non-terminal technical problem, like when Norris suffered a brake issue in China? Imagine that happens again but to the leading car. Would McLaren have to urge the chasing car not to take advantage? It's all hypothetical, but that's kind of the point. If McLaren didn't already have plans in place for the various potential outcomes in the race outside of their driver's control, the intervention in Italy means the team bosses might now have to work that out. Unless, of course, this rule all starts and ends with pit stops, but that's not straightforward either. What counts as a bad pit stop? We can all agree Monza was very bad. Many can see McLaren's argument for why it was bad enough to correct because it changed their positions. But how bad is time to interfere bad? Over the last 5 events, Norris pit stops have taken a second longer on average than Piastri's. In a close fight between the two, that can just as easily impact the outcome as what happened at Monza. Where McLaren chooses to draw the line will be interesting. Looking at the season as a whole, Norris has more bad pit stops, but Piastri has more in the 3 to 4 second range, 11 of those compared to 4 for Norris. A 4-second pit stop is slow, but does it only become a major problem if it costs the position? Where does the line get drawn? Is it the extent of a mistake, or is it the outcome? What if a mediocre but not obviously disastrous pit stop means the two drivers don't swap position, but it allows the chasing car close enough that it completely changes the dynamic of the race? We're back into reeling off questions again, but you get the idea. Maybe this falls under what Piastri hinted at in Italy, that pit stops are just part of racing. Piastri clearly felt in the heat of the moment that Norris's slow left front wheel change should be classified as bad luck, and not something that warrants team intervention according to its principles. He called the decision to swap places a fair request and a fair decision, and said there's a lot of people and a culture to protect at McLaren. But when asked to explain his radio message that he couldn't understand what had changed regarding slow pit stops, and whether he expected to be asked to move aside in this specific instance, Piastri replied, "I think the radio call kind of says enough," before adding, "I'm sure we'll discuss it again." That's not entirely clear, which could be a problem. It would seem in this specific case, what McLaren intended to do if and when one of its drivers suffered a slow pit stop was trumped by its wider intention to not affect the final result by pitting the second driver ahead of the first one. You see how messy this can get. It's quite clear the slow wheel change scenario has been discussed before, but it's not entirely clear whether the superseding of that by a pit stop sequencing inversion has actually become concretely inserted into McLaren's racing principles. The fact this topic absolutely dominated the questions we got from the Race Members Club on Sunday night, and had a long burn in fan discussions too, including plenty of team bias related conspiracy theories, says 2 things. 1, wow, this F1 season desperately needs some actual interesting drama. And 2, the championship battle actually is becoming very divisive, even though it's happening in an unusual way. This was an active incident rather than a hypothetical, so it's not surprising that it sparks debate more than the Hungarian Grand Prix strategy switch did over Norris's retirement at Zandvoort. This was direct interference, even though it was corrective, and regardless of the justification. And it stands as proof that it's the McLaren side, not the driver's side, that is ultimately the source of the greatest tension. Maybe that will change as we get into the final races and Piastri and Norris need to put everything on the line, but for now this is not the same as, say, the Mercedes battle in 2016 that Wolff oversaw between Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg. Wolff believes his drivers were 2 different animals in the car who took no prisoners racing against each other, whereas McLaren's duo is fighting in a different way. There is certainly not the same personal animosity as underpinned the Hamilton-Rosberg rivalry, and there is a desire from both Norris and Piastri to do right by the team. That feeds into McLaren wanting to try to contain certain circumstances very closely, while at the same time trying to let the drivers be free to fight. Compared to Mercedes, for example, the 2 McLarens have greater strategic flexibility, but on the flip side, there is clearly an expectation from the team, and an acceptance from the drivers, that this requires them to fall in line at times when they don't want to. This wouldn't happen at one-sided Red Bull, for example, but even at Mercedes the drivers would do their own thing. Hamilton ignored team orders against Rosberg more than once, so it's not like Mercedes didn't try, it was just futile. In hindsight, Wolff says he would handle 2016 differently now, although he's never really opened up on how. But it's unlikely he'd waste his time trying to orchestrate events as much as McLaren has opted to this year.